The sound of shattering glass echoed through the upscale restaurant as Zara Williams dove across the marble floor, her hand slamming down on the Korean businessman's wrist just as he was about to sign the contract. The room fell silent except for her ragged breathing and the soft clatter of the expensive pen hitting the ground. "Don't sign that," she whispered urgently. Her dark eyes locked on his shocked face. Around them, men in expensive suits reached inside their jackets, but the businessman, whose presence commanded the entire room, held up a single hand to stop them. Kim Jun-ho stared at the young black woman who had just thrown herself between him and what should have been the most important business deal of his year. Her waitress uniform was torn at the shoulder from her dramatic intervention, her natural curls escaping from her neat ponytail, but her gaze was steady and determined. "The numbers," she said breathlessly, pointing at the contract with a trembling finger. "The third column, line 15. They changed the decimal point. You're not buying their company, you're giving them yours." The silence stretched impossibly long before Junho's eyes moved to the document, then back to her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Everyone out. Now." 3 hours earlier, Zara Williams had been having the worst week of her life, and that was saying something considering the past 2 years had been a continuous string of challenges that would have broken most people. She stood in the employee break room of Lumiere, Manhattan's most exclusive Korean-French fusion restaurant, staring at the termination notice in her trembling hands. "Effective immediately," she read aloud to the empty room, her voice barely above a whisper. The words blurred as tears threatened to spill over. "Due to budget restructuring." She crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, then immediately retrieved it. She couldn't afford the luxury of dramatic gestures. She needed this notice for unemployment paperwork, assuming she could even qualify. Her hands smoothed out the wrinkled document as she fought to control her breathing. 26 years old, and this was her third job loss in 18 months. Not because she was incompetent. Her supervisors always praised her work ethic, her attention to detail, her ability to remember complex orders without writing them down. No, Zara Williams lost jobs because she was too good at noticing things others missed, too willing to speak up when she saw problems, too honest for her own good in a world that often rewarded looking the other way. At her last position as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, she'd discovered discrepancies in the client files, numbers that didn't add up, transactions that seemed designed to hide rather than record. When she'd brought it to her supervisor's attention, she'd been told to mind her own business. When she'd persisted, she'd been fired for not being a good cultural fit. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her mathematics degree from Columbia, earned while working 3 part-time jobs and caring for her sick grandmother, had been supposed to open doors. Instead, it seemed to make her a threat to people who preferred their employees to be less observant. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate. "Rent's due tomorrow, you good?" Zara closed her eyes and leaned against the metal lockers. She had exactly $89 in savings. Rent was $200 for her share of the tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Queens that she shared with Maya, a nursing student who was barely scraping by herself. She couldn't ask her family for help. Her mother was already working double shifts at the hospital in Atlanta to support Zara's younger brother's college tuition, and her father had been out of work since his construction company downsized. They thought she was thriving in New York, living her dream of using her mathematical skills in the big city. She couldn't bear to tell them the truth. The break room door opened, and Chen, the head server, poked his head in. "Zara, Mr. Park wants to see you before you go." Mr. Park, the restaurant manager, was a kind man in his 50s who had hired her despite her lack of fine dining experience. He'd seen something in her, maybe the way she'd calculated the tip percentages for a complex party bill in her head during the interview, or how she'd noticed and corrected an error in the reservation system that had been causing double bookings for weeks. She found him in his small office behind the kitchen, looking genuinely distressed. "Zara, sit down, please." "Mr. Park, I understand about the budget cuts." "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "This isn't about budget cuts. This is about tonight." Zara's stomach dropped. "Tonight? We have a very important private dinner, very important people. The owner specifically requested that all staff be—" He paused, clearly uncomfortable. He requested a specific type of service staff for this event. Understanding dawned slowly, followed by a familiar burning sensation in her chest. He doesn't want black servers. Mr. Park's silence was answer enough. He looked ashamed but not surprised, which somehow made it worse. I see. Zara's voice was steady, though inside she felt something cracking. So I'm being fired because of a racist client. The termination notice was prepared in advance, Mr. Park said quietly. I was told to use the budget restructuring excuse. I'm sorry, Zara. You're one of the best employees we've ever had, but not the right color for tonight's important guests. Mr. Park handed her an envelope. There's 2 weeks' severance in there. I know it's not much, but it's what I could manage. Zara took the envelope, her pride warring with her practical need for the money. Practical need won. Thank you. She was gathering her things from her locker when Chen appeared again. Zara, wait. I have an idea. Chen, I appreciate whatever you're thinking, but listen to me. Tonight's dinner is huge, like huge. The owner's son is flying in from Seoul, and there's some major business deal happening. They need extra security staff to serve. People who can blend in but also watch for problems. I'm not security, Chen. No, but you're smart. Smarter than anyone else here. And you notice things. He lowered his voice. The security company they hired? They're looking for someone who can serve but also keep an eye on documents, contracts, that kind of thing. Someone who understands numbers. Why would you help me? I just got fired. Chen smiled sadly. Because what happened to you tonight is bullshit, and because I've seen you catch mistakes that would have cost this place thousands. Maybe it's time someone appreciated that skill. An hour later, Zara found herself in the back office of Sentinel Security Services, facing a stern-looking Korean-American woman named Director Kim. Your mathematics background is impressive, Director Kim said, reviewing Zara's hastily printed resume. And Chen vouches for your observational skills. But this isn't a normal serving job. You'll be in a room with very powerful, very dangerous people if something goes wrong. What kind of dangerous? Zara interrupted. Director Kim studied her for a long moment. The kind where asking too many questions can be hazardous to your health, but also the kind where the right person, noticing the right detail at the right time, could prevent something catastrophic. And you think I'm that person? Chen thinks you are. And Chen has never been wrong about people. Director Kim slid a contract across the desk. 1 night, $5,000. You serve drinks, you watch for anything unusual, and you report only to me. Zara stared at the number. $5,000 would cover rent for 4 months. It would give her time to find another job, maybe even be selective about it. What exactly am I watching for? Anything that doesn't belong. Wrong faces, wrong numbers, wrong behavior. You'll be invisible to them, just another server, but your job is to see everything. As Zara signed the contract, she had no idea that in 3 hours she would be throwing herself across a marble floor to stop a man she'd never met from making a decision that would change both their lives forever. The only thing she knew for certain was that her mathematical mind, her attention to detail, and her inability to stay quiet when she noticed problems were about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. Kim Jun-ho arrived at Lumiere precisely at 8 o'clock, which was exactly what everyone expected, from the man who had transformed his family's small, Seoul-based import business into one of Asia's most powerful conglomerates in less than a decade. At 34, he commanded respect through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking, unwavering discipline, and a reputation for making decisions that others found ruthless but which always proved profitable. Tonight, however, felt different. Tonight carried the weight of legacy and the promise of expansion that would cement his position not just in Korea, but globally. He moved through the restaurant's main dining area toward the private room that had been reserved for this meeting, his presence causing subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Conversations quieted slightly, servers moved with more precision, and even the ambient lighting seemed to focus more sharply. This wasn't conscious deference. It was the natural response to someone who had learned to carry authority like a second skin. Junho's charcoal grey suit was perfectly tailored, his black hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of morning routines that never varied. His movements were economical, purposeful, and gave no hint of the tension that had been building in his chest for the past week. The deal he was here to finalize would give him controlling interest in Marcus Chen Industries, a California-based tech company that specialized in AI-driven logistics software. It was exactly the kind of forward-thinking acquisition that would position his company for the next phase of global expansion. The numbers were solid, the projections were excellent. And Marcus Chen himself had been courting this partnership for months. But something had been nagging at Junho since the preliminary contracts had arrived. Not something he could identify, just a feeling that lived somewhere between his analytical mind and his instincts. In his experience, when those two things disagreed, it was usually because he was missing information. Mr. Kim. Marcus Chen rose from his seat as Junho entered the private dining room. Chen was a man in his 50s, American-born Chinese with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that Junho had learned to be wary of in business partners. "Thank you for making the trip. I know how valuable your time is." Mr. Chen. Junho's greeting was polite but measured. He took his seat at the head of the table, noting the positioning of Chen's associates, 2 lawyers and a financial advisor, all of whom looked slightly nervous despite their professional composure. The servers began bringing the first course, and Junho found his attention briefly caught by one of them, a young black woman with intelligent eyes who moved with unusual precision. Most servers in high-end establishments were trained to be invisible, but this one seemed to actually see the room, her gaze taking in details with the kind of systematic attention he recognized in people who thought analytically. "The contracts are exactly as we discussed," Chen was saying, sliding the leather portfolio across the table. "I think you'll find everything in order." Junho opened the portfolio, but didn't immediately look down. Instead, he watched Chen's face, noting the slight tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed silently against the table. These were tells that most people would miss, but Junho had built his success on reading people as carefully as he read financial statements. "The due diligence process was quite thorough," Junho said, his voice neutral, "though I noticed some of the subsidiary information was provided rather late in the process." "Standard complications," Chen replied quickly. "You know how these things go, lawyers being overly cautious, accountants wanting to triple-check everything." Junho nodded and finally looked down at the contract. The numbers were exactly as they had been in the preliminary agreements. Purchase price, equity distribution, management structure, everything aligned with what they had negotiated. So why did that nagging feeling persist? The black server appeared at his elbow, refilling his water glass with movements that were somehow both deferential and confident. As she moved around the table, Junho noticed that her eyes kept returning to the contract, though she was clearly trying to be discreet about it. "Is there something concerning you about the terms?" Chen asked, and Junho realized he had been staring at the document for longer than necessary. "Just being thorough," Junho replied. "In my experience, the details that seem least important often prove to be the most significant." Chen laughed, but it sounded forced. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Junho began reading through the contract systematically, his trained eye moving through the legal language with practiced efficiency. Purchase price, $847 million, his equity stake, 67%. Management control, transferred upon signing. Everything was exactly as negotiated, but as he read, he became aware that the server, Zara, according to her name tag, had positioned herself near the side table where she was arranging dessert plates, and her body language had changed. She was still performing her duties, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "The timeline for integration is aggressive but manageable," Chen was saying. "We can have the transition completed within 60 days. Junho nodded absently, but his attention was now divided between the contract and the server, whose presence had become somehow significant in a way he couldn't explain. She was looking at the contract again, and this time her expression was troubled. "Mr. Kim," Chen's voice carried a note of impatience. "Are you ready to proceed?" Junho picked up the gold pen that had been provided, the same pen he had used to sign dozens of major deals over the years. The weight of it was familiar, reassuring. All he had to do was sign his name, and Marcus Chen Industries would become a subsidiary of Kim Global Enterprises. He positioned the pen at the signature line, and that was when he noticed the server had gone completely still. She was staring at the contract with an expression of barely controlled alarm, and her hands were clenched at her sides. "Actually," Junho said, setting the pen down, "I'd like to review the subsidiary breakdown one more time." Chen's smile flickered. "Of course. Page 15, Section 3. Junho flipped to page 15 and began reading the subsidiary information again. The numbers were the same as they had been in every previous version. Marcus Chen Industries held controlling interests in 7 smaller companies, with total assets valued at $1.2 billion. But as he read, He became aware that Zara had moved closer to the table, ostensibly to clear some plates. But her eyes were fixed on the contract with laser focus, and suddenly she was moving, not toward him but around the table, her movements quick and purposeful. "Don't sign that," she said, her voice cutting through the room's polite conversation like a blade. The room erupted into chaos. Chen's associates started to rise from their seats, voices raised in protest and confusion. But Junho held up a single hand and the room fell silent. "Explain," he said to Zara, his voice deadly quiet. She was breathing hard, her professional composure completely abandoned, but her voice was steady. "The numbers, the third column, line 15. They changed the decimal point." Junho looked down at the contract, then back at her face. "Show me." With trembling fingers, Zara pointed to a line in the subsidiary breakdown. Marcus Chen Industries' stake in the subsidiaries. It says 7%, but in every other document it was 67%. They moved the decimal point. "You're not buying their company, you're giving them yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Junho's eyes moved from Zara's face to the contract, then to Marcus Chen, whose expression had gone from confusion to panic in the span of seconds. "Everyone out," Junho said quietly. "Now." As the room emptied, leaving only Junho and Zara, he continued to stare at the contract, his mind racing through the implications of what she had just revealed. If she was right, and the sick feeling in his stomach suggested she was, then he had been minutes away from signing over control of his entire empire to a man who had been planning to steal it from the beginning. He looked up at the young woman who had just saved him from the most catastrophic mistake of his life, and for the first time in years, Kim Junho found himself completely at a loss for words. "You just saved me from a mistake that would have destroyed me." The words hung in the air between them as Junho stared at Zara, his dark eyes intense with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't identify. The private dining room felt enormous now that it was empty, except for the two of them, the abandoned contract lying on the table like evidence of a crime that had almost been committed. Zara's heart was still racing from her impulsive intervention. She had thrown away every rule of professional behavior, every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson about staying invisible and keeping her mouth shut. And yet, looking at the relief and dawning realization on this powerful man's face, she knew she had done the right thing. She started, then stopped, unsure how to explain what had compelled her to act. "I have a mathematics degree. Numbers are. They're like a language to me. When I saw that decimal point, it was like seeing a word spelled wrong in a sentence. It just jumped out." Junho stood slowly, his movements controlled but charged with energy. "Show me exactly what you saw." Zara approached the table hesitantly, acutely aware that she was still wearing her server's uniform, that her hands were shaking slightly, that she was about to point out financial fraud to one of the most powerful men in the room. But his attention was completely focused on her, waiting for her explanation, with the kind of intensity that suggested her words could change everything. "Here," she said, pointing to line 15. "Marcus Chen Industries' controlling stake in subsidiary companies. This contract says 7%, but every other document I've seen tonight, the preliminary agreements, the due diligence reports, even the summary sheet, they all said 67%. Junho leaned closer to examine the document, and Zara caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and understated that somehow fit perfectly with his controlled presence. "You've seen the other documents?" "I was hired by Sentinel Security to observe tonight, to watch for anything unusual." She took a breath. "Moving a decimal point to change 67% to 7% is definitely unusual. If Chen only controlled 7% of the subsidiaries instead of 67%, then the total value of what I would be purchasing—" Junho's voice trailed off as he worked through the mathematics. "Would be about 2 billion, Zara finished, which means you would be paying 80 million and in exchange you'd be giving Marcus Chen 67% control of your company." The implications hit Junho like a physical blow. He had been minutes away from signing a contract that would have handed his life's work to a man who had orchestrated an elaborate theft. The preliminary documents, the months of negotiations, the careful building of trust, all of it had been designed to lead to this moment when his attention would be focused on the familiar numbers, while the crucial detail was hidden in plain sight. "How did you notice this when my lawyers didn't?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration. Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Maybe because I was looking at it differently. I wasn't reading it as a legal document, I was reading it as a math problem. And in math, precision matters. Every digit, every decimal point, every symbol has to be exactly right, or the entire equation fails. Junho studied her face with the same intensity he had given the contract. "What's your name?" "Zara Williams." "Zara Williams," he repeated as if testing how it sounded. "And you work for Sentinel Security?" "Just tonight I was actually fired from my waitressing job here earlier today." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted revealing her vulnerability to this man who clearly wielded enormous power. But instead of the dismissal or pity she expected, Junho's expression sharpened with interest. "Fired for what?" "For being the wrong color for tonight's important guests," she said, meeting his gaze directly. If she was going to be honest, she might as well be completely honest. Something flickered across Junho's face, surprise, followed by what looked like anger, though she sensed it wasn't directed at her. "And yet you're here anyway." Chen, one of the servers, connected me with Sentinel Security. They needed someone who could blend in, but also watch for problems. She gestured toward the contract. "I guess they were right about the problems part." Junho was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between her face and the fraudulent contract. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of decision that seemed to change the very air in the room. "Zara Williams, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay. Do you have anywhere you need to be tonight?" The question caught her off guard. No. "Why?" "Because Marcus Chen is going to realize very soon that his plan has failed, and when he does, he's going to want to know how. Which means he's going to want to know about you." Junho's expression was serious, almost grim. "I can't let that happen." A chill ran down Zara's spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you've just made yourself a target by saving me, and I'm saying that I don't abandon people who risk themselves for me." He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "My security team will escort you home and make sure you're safe." "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is." His tone brooked no argument. "Marcus Chen has spent months planning this fraud. He's not going to simply accept defeat and walk away. He'll want revenge, and he'll want to silence anyone who can expose what he tried to do." The reality of her situation began to sink in. By speaking up, by preventing the signing, she had inserted herself into something much larger and more dangerous than she had realized. What happens now? Now, I make some phone calls. Marcus Chen is about to discover that attempting to defraud Kim Global Enterprises was the worst decision of his life. Junho's voice carried a cold certainty that made Zara grateful she was on his side. "But first, I make sure you're protected." His phone buzzed with a response to his text. "My team is here. They'll take you home and stay with you until this is resolved." "Wait," Zara said as he moved toward the door. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Junho paused, his hand on the door handle. When he turned back to her, his expression was softer than it had been all evening, though no less intense. "Because you saw something that could have destroyed me, and instead of staying silent, instead of protecting yourself, you chose to protect me. That kind of integrity is rare, Zara Williams, and it's valuable." As he opened the door and gestured for her to precede him, Zara realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. She had started the evening as an unemployed waitress with $247 in her bank account, and no prospects for the future. Now, she was under the protection of one of the most powerful men she had ever met, and she had no idea what that meant for her future, only that it would be unlike anything she had ever imagined. 3 days later, Zara sat in her tiny Queens apartment, staring at the business card that had arrived by courier that morning. The card was simple, elegant and expensive, heavy cream cardstock with Kim Global Enterprises embossed in gold lettering. On the back, someone had written in precise handwriting, "Lunch today, 1 p.m., the address below, please come, J.H." She had been under protection since the night at Lumiere, which meant that 2 polite but intimidating security guards had been stationed outside her building, and another had followed her to the grocery store and the laundromat. It was surreal and comforting and terrifying all at once. The news about Marcus Chen had broken yesterday. Federal investigators had raided his offices, and the financial press was calling it one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud attempts in recent history. Zara's name hadn't appeared in any of the articles, but she knew that her intervention had started the investigation that brought Chen's scheme to light. Now Junho wanted to see her, and she had no idea why. The address on the card led her to a private dining room at the Modern, a restaurant that Zara had only read about in magazines. The kind of place where lunch for two could cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a month. She felt underdressed in her best blouse and skirt, but it was the most professional outfit she owned. Junho was already seated when she arrived, and he stood as she entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed automatic, but somehow made her feel both respected and nervous. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than her rent, but his expression was less formal than it had been at Lumiere, more open. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "Your invitation was compelling," Zara replied, settling into her chair. The dining room was elegant and private, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure why I'm here." "Because I have a proposition for you." A server appeared to pour water and offer menus, but Junho waved them away with a polite gesture that suggested this conversation was more important than food. "What kind of proposition?" Zara asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what happened at Lumiere, about the fact that you saw something in 30 seconds that my lawyers missed after weeks of review." Junho leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on her. "I've also spent time learning about you." Zara's stomach tightened. "Learning about me how?" "Publicly available information. Your academic record at Columbia, summa cum laude in mathematics, with a focus on financial modeling. Your work history. 3 jobs in 18 months, all ending when you identified problems that your employers preferred to ignore." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood the frustration those experiences must have caused. "You're brilliant, Zara, but you're working in environments that don't value brilliance, they value compliance. And you're different. I'm someone who nearly lost everything because the people around me valued compliance over truth." Junho's voice carried a weight of recent realization. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't spoken up, Marcus Chen would own my company right now. I would have signed away everything I've built because everyone around me was too polite, too deferential, or too afraid to tell me I was making a mistake." Zara studied his face, trying to read the intention behind his words. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I want you to work for me. Not as a server, not as someone who has to stay invisible and keep quiet. I want you to be the person who notices what others miss, who asks the questions others are afraid to ask, who tells me the truth even when it's uncomfortable." The offer hung between them like something too large to fully comprehend. "What kind of position are you talking about?" "Financial analyst initially, but with a specific mandate. You would report directly to me, and your job would be to find the problems, the inconsistencies, the details that don't add up. You would have access to all our major deals, all our contracts, all our financial data." Junho paused, letting the scope of what he was offering sink in. "You would be my early warning system." Zara felt her heart racing. It was everything she had hoped for when she'd graduated from Columbia, a position where her mathematical skills would be valued, where her attention to detail would be an asset rather than a liability. But it also felt too good to be true. "Why me? You could hire anyone. People with more experience, more credentials, more what? More willingness to stay quiet when they see problems?" Junho shook his head. "Experience can be taught. Credentials can be earned. But integrity, the willingness to risk yourself to do what's right, that's something you either have or you don't. And you've already proven you have it." The server returned, and this time Junho allowed them to take orders, though Zara barely registered what she asked for. Her mind was spinning with the possibilities and implications of what he was offering. "There's something else you should know," Junho said after the server left. "The position comes with a salary of $150, $0 per year, plus bonuses based on the problems you identify and help solve." Zara nearly choked on her water. $150 $0 was more than 4 times what she had been making as a waitress, more than she had ever imagined earning in her first real professional position. That's incredibly generous. It's what you're worth, Junho said simply. And it's a fraction of what you saved me by catching Chen's fraud. Their food arrived, but Zara found it difficult to eat. The offer was everything she had dreamed of, but something about the situation felt too intense, too personal. The way Junho looked at her when he spoke, the way he seemed to really see her rather than looking through her, the way most powerful people did, it created a tension that had nothing to do with business. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Why does this feel like more than just a job offer?" Junho was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. "Because it is more than just a job offer, because you're the first person in years who has surprised me, who has made me question my assumptions, who has—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Who has made me remember that there are still people in the world who choose to do the right thing even when it costs them something." The admission hung between them, charged with implications that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Zara felt something shifting in the space between them, something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. But Zara—" He reached across the table and briefly touched her hand, the contact sending an unexpected jolt of electricity through her. "Don't think too long. The world is full of people who will try to convince you that your integrity is a liability. I'm offering you a place where it's your greatest asset." As they left the restaurant, Zara realized that Junho's offer represented more than just a job. It was a chance to step into a life she had never imagined possible, but it also meant stepping into his world. And she was beginning to understand that Kim Junho was a man who inspired feelings that were far more complicated than simple professional respect. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out where those feelings might lead. Zara's answer came not in words but in action. 2 days after their lunch, she found herself standing in the lobby of the Kim Global Enterprises building at 8 a.m. sharp, wearing a new navy suit that had cost her most of her remaining savings but made her feel like she could belong in Junho's world. The building itself was a testament to power and success, 43 floors of steel and glass that seemed to reach toward the sky with the same ambition that had built the empire it housed. As she rode the elevator to the 38th floor, Zara tried to calm her nerves and remind herself that she belonged here, that her skills had earned her this opportunity. Junho's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Park, led her through a maze of offices and conference rooms to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. "Mr. Kim is in meetings until 10, Mrs. Park explained, but he wanted you to get started immediately. These are the files he'd like you to review." The stack of documents was intimidating. Contracts, financial statements, due diligence reports for 3 separate potential acquisitions. But as Zara settled behind the mahogany desk and opened the first file, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of work that matched her capabilities. She lost herself in the numbers, her mind moving through financial projections and risk assessments with the fluidity that had made her professors at Columbia take notice. It was like speaking her native language after months of forced silence. She was deep in analysis of a potential acquisition in Singapore when Junho appeared in her doorway. "Finding anything interesting?" Zara looked up, startled by how much time had passed. The morning sun had given way to afternoon light, and her desk was covered with notes and calculations. "Actually, yes. The Singapore deal. There's something off about their revenue projections." Junho entered the office and closed the door behind him, his presence immediately making the spacious room feel more intimate. "Show me." For the next hour, they worked side by side, Zara explaining her analysis while Junho asked probing questions that demonstrated why he had built such a successful empire. Their collaboration was seamless, her mathematical precision complementing his strategic thinking in ways that felt natural and exciting. "You're right," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "The revenue growth they're projecting isn't sustainable given their market position. If we acquired them at their asking price, we'd be overpaying by at least 30%. "Which means walking away from the deal," Zara said. "Which means renegotiating from a position of strength." Junho smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely captivating. "This is exactly why I needed you here." The praise sent warmth through Zara's chest, but it was accompanied by an awareness of how close they were sitting, how his attention made her feel both professionally validated and personally seen in ways that were dangerous to her peace of mind. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that was both productive and increasingly charged with unspoken tension. Zara would arrive early to review files, Junho would stop by her office for analysis and discussion, and together they would dissect deals and strategies with a partnership that felt effortless. But it was the moments between the work that created the real tension. The way Junho's hand would brush hers when he reached for a document, the way his eyes would linger on her face when she was explaining a complex calculation, the way conversations about business would somehow drift into more personal territory. "You never told me why you came to New York," he said one evening as they worked late on a particularly complex acquisition. "Same reason most people come here, I suppose, to build something bigger than what was possible back home." Zara looked up from her laptop to find him watching her with that intense focus that always made her pulse quicken. "What about you? You could run your business from Seoul. Why maintain such a large presence here?" "Because this is where the future is being decided," Junho said. "And because—" He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Because I've always believed that the most important opportunities come from unexpected places." The weight of his gaze made it clear that he wasn't just talking about business opportunities, and Zara felt her carefully maintained professional boundaries beginning to blur. The moment that changed everything came 3 weeks into her employment, during a late-night strategy session for a major acquisition in Tokyo. They had been working for hours, the office building empty except for security and cleaning staff, the city lights creating a glittering backdrop beyond the windows. "We should call it a night," Junho said finally, rubbing his temples in a gesture of exhaustion that made him seem more human, more accessible. "The presentation is tomorrow," Zara protested. "We need to finish the risk assessment." "Zara." His voice was soft but firm. "You've been here since 7 this morning. You need rest." "So have you." "I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it healthy." The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying more concern than was strictly professional. Junho looked at her with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. "When was the last time someone worried about my health?" The question hung between them, revealing a loneliness that his success and power couldn't mask. Zara found herself standing, moving around the desk toward him without conscious decision. "When was the last time you let them?" she asked softly. He stood as well, and suddenly they were close enough that she could see the fatigue in his eyes, the vulnerability he kept hidden beneath his controlled exterior. "I don't usually let people get close enough to worry." "Why not?" "Because caring about people makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability is dangerous in my world." "But loneliness is worse," Zara said, the words coming from a place of understanding that surprised her. "I know because I've been lonely too." Something shifted in Junho's expression, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. "Zara." "I know this is complicated," she said quickly. "I know there are a dozen reasons why this is a bad idea, but I also know that what I feel when I'm with you isn't just professional respect." "What you feel?" His voice was barely above a whisper, like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for. The admission hung between them for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then Junho reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled demeanor. "You have no idea how dangerous it is for me to care about you," he said softly. "Then don't think about the danger," Zara replied, covering his hand with hers. "Think about what it feels like to not be alone." When he kissed her, it was with the intensity of someone who had been holding back for weeks, and Zara realized that all her careful professional boundaries had been an illusion. This connection, this feeling of rightness, had been building since the moment she had thrown herself across that restaurant floor to save him from a mistake that would have destroyed him. As they broke apart, both breathing hard, Junho rested his forehead against hers. "You just saved me from a mistake that would have destroyed me," he whispered, echoing the words he had spoken that first night, but with an entirely different meaning. "What mistake?" Zara asked. "Believing that I could keep you at a distance, believing that what I feel for you is something I can control or ignore. His arms tightened around her. You're not just my analyst, Zara. You're not just someone who works for me. You're... What? You're mine, he said with quiet certainty. And I'm yours. And everything else, the complications, the risks, the reasons this should be impossible, none of that matters compared to that truth. As Zara looked into his eyes, she realized that her life had changed again, just as dramatically as it had that night at Lumiere. She had started as an unemployed waitress, become a financial analyst, and now found herself claimed by a man whose intensity matched her own, whose world was becoming her world, whose future was becoming inseparable from her own. And for the first time since coming to New York, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Years later, Zara would look back on that night in Junho's office as the moment when her real life began, not just because it marked the beginning of their relationship, but because it was when she finally understood that her greatest strength, her inability to stay silent when she saw problems, wasn't a liability to be managed, but a gift to be treasured. The morning after their first kiss, she had arrived at the office expecting awkwardness, uncertainty, maybe even regret. Instead, she found Junho waiting for her with coffee and a smile that made her heart race all over again. "Good morning, Ms. Williams," he had said formally, but his eyes held warmth and promise that made the professional greeting feel like an endearment. "Good morning, Mr. Kim," she had replied, matching his tone while fighting back a smile of her own. They had maintained their professional facades during business hours, but the undercurrent of connection between them had only grown stronger. Late nights working on acquisitions became opportunities for stolen moments and whispered conversations. Business trips became chances to explore new cities together, to share meals and dreams and the kind of intimacy that comes from truly seeing and being seen by another person. The transformation in Junho had been gradual but profound. The controlled, isolated man she had first met began to reveal layers of humor, vulnerability and warmth that he had kept hidden for years. He learned to trust not just her professional judgment, but her emotional wisdom. And she learned that beneath his powerful exterior was someone who had been waiting his entire life for a person who would see him completely and love him anyway. Their relationship had faced challenges, whispered speculation from colleagues, cultural pressures from his family and soul, the inherent complications of mixing business with personal feelings. But each obstacle had only strengthened their bond, proving that what they had built together was resilient enough to withstand external pressures. Now, as Zara stood in the penthouse apartment they shared, watching the sun set over Manhattan, while Junho finished a conference call with their Seoul office, she marveled at how perfectly their lives had intertwined. She was no longer just his analyst. She had become his partner in every sense of the word, helping to guide Kim Global Enterprises through expansions and acquisitions that had doubled the company's value. The Tokyo deal closed successfully, Junho said, ending his call and joining her at the window. His arms came around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest with the contentment of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. "I saw the numbers. 15% above projections in the first quarter. Thanks to your analysis of their market position." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I don't know how I made decisions before you." "Poorly, apparently," Zara teased, turning in his arms to face him. "Very poorly," he agreed, his expression growing serious. "I was so focused on protecting myself, on maintaining control, that I almost missed the most important thing that ever happened to me." "Which was?" "A brilliant woman throwing herself across a restaurant floor to save me from my own blindness." His hands framed her face with the same gentleness he had shown that first night in his office. "You didn't just save my business, Zara. You saved me." As he kissed her, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as someone who noticed problems others missed, and she had become someone who noticed possibilities others couldn't see. The greatest possibility of all had been the man in her arms, powerful and vulnerable, controlled and passionate, someone who had needed exactly what she had to offer, and who offered exactly what she had been searching for. Their love story had begun with numbers and contracts, with fraud and deception, with a moment of courage that had changed both their lives. But it had grown into something that transcended business, something that proved that the most important calculations weren't about money or market share, but about the mathematics of two hearts finding their perfect equation. And as the lights of New York glittered below them, Zara knew that she had finally found the life she had been meant to live, not as someone who had to hide her intelligence or dim her light to fit in, but as someone whose brilliance was celebrated, whose voice was valued, and whose love was cherished by a man who saw her exactly as she was and wouldn't have her any other way.